Well, welcome back. This gospel today has so many different angles that we can look at, and there's so much hope in the gospel as well. You know, the first thing that I find really interesting is the fact that Jesus went up to the person who was ill. Normally, everyone goes to Jesus. But this time, Jesus went to the person lying on the mat. And I think that gives us an idea that, you know, the Lord knows what we're going through. But you know, when he approached the man, he asked the man if he wanted to be made well. He had to acknowledge it. He had to ask. He had to have an answer. It had to be clear. So if Jesus went up to him, he had to find out what he really desired. And this part really throws me off a little bit, because Jesus says to the man, "Do you want to be made well?" And what's he say? "Well, I've been here for 38 years, and, you know, no one's helped me, and, you know, and when I think I can do it, somebody gets in my way and cuts me off, and, you know, really? I mean, what's that all about?" Now, granted, he didn't know that that was Jesus. He didn't know that this guy was going to be able to heal him. But I'd like to think if I was having, you know, a situation, I'd like to think that I would say yes. Just say yes. I mean, instead of, you know, why does he want to hear all this other stuff? You know, I can remember in a parish, one of my altar servers, he was in high school, played hockey. He served a 7:30 Mass for me one Sunday morning, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I get a call from his grandmother telling me that he is in the hospital with a broken neck. And I'm like, oh my. So I said, okay, I'm on my way. He was playing hockey, and he got injured. So I get into the room, and here he is on this board, and, you know, the head is strapped just so, because he can't move, because it could paralyze him or kill him, you know. And so, you know, here he is, probably 15, 16 years old, and he sees me, and he starts to cry. And, you know, my heart just melted. I mean, this is a tough guy. I mean, a heart of gold. But, you know, the exterior that he put out, and then to see him just, you know, cry. And, you know, I said to him, his name was Bobby. I said, "Bobby," I says, "everything's going to be okay." And I'm like, "Oh, you don't know that? Don't say that." We were taught that in the seminary. Never to go and say, "Oh, you know, the person could, you know, look like an olive color in the hospital," and you go, "Oh, you look great." No, you're not supposed to do that. So anyway, I said, "I'm going to anoint you." I says, "This is the sacrament of the sick. It's a sacrament of healing. And God, you know, can heal you. It might be physically, it might be emotionally, it might be spiritually, or he might prepare you to meet him." And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if God chooses to heal you physically. And this mother standing right there and said, yes, pray, pray. And I'm like, okay, And so, they said the prayers. It was very emotional. And they were going to airlift him to a trauma center. And so, I stayed with them till they were going to put him on the helicopter. And I went home. And of course, I prayed. Everybody was praying for him. And about maybe 8 o'clock at night, the phone rang. I answered it. It was the grandmother again. You healed him, Father. You healed him. And she's going, I'm like, what? And, she says, his neck isn't broken. And I go, all right, calm down, Elizabeth. Tell me what happened. He says, they took him over, to the medical center. And they decided before they brought him into surgery to do x-rays again. And they couldn't find the break. They couldn't find the break. He says, you healed him, Father. I says, no, Elizabeth, let's get this straight. I didn't heal him. The Lord healed him. The Lord maybe worked through me, but the Lord did all the work. I didn't. It's just a glorious moment to see. And so, I think of this guy here going, just, having a hard time, and nobody wants to help me. Are we one of those people when we get sick? I know when I get a cold, I'm like, okay, Lord Jesus, come and take me. I'm ready. I'm yours. I'm not, that kind of person that can tolerate that. I say the act of contrition, and I surrender everything, and I make sure I put that envelope on my dresser that says open in the event of death, and I'm ready to go, with the first sniffle. And then there's other people that are just an inspiration. They can be so sick and so positive, so joy-filled. They offer us so much hope. They never complain. My mother, when she was dying, she was on hospice care for 10 and a half months. 10 and a half months. And, we all moved home to help my dad take care of my mom. And, my mom was a sickly woman most of her life. So, we were kind of used to having her having 9 lives or whatever, because there was a lot of times we thought we were standing at the deathbed, and it was just a respite, and we used to say, oh, I can just imagine, what's going to happen. My father was a shoe salesman, and I'd say, the doctor's going to call the shoe store, and he's going to say, Tim, we tried everything, but she just didn't make it. And my father's going to say to the doctor, give her 10 minutes, she'll come back. So my mother being on hospice for 10 and a half months, it was a long time. And, she struggled. And did we worry? And did she have difficult moments? Yes. But the only day she didn't get out of bed was the day she died. She gave it everything she got. If I said to her, would you like to go for a ride? She'd say to me, give me a Percocet. It's a pain pill, and it's a pretty strong one too, But it was hard for her. She was, almost immobile. She had to have a brace on her leg and everything, but she had to get down the stairs, 4 stairs to get out of the house. and to come back into the house. And she needed that to help her with the pain to get out of the house. But she'd go. She'd go. And then came the day when she finally surrendered her body to the earth and gave her soul back to God. In a most glorious moment, filled with so much symbolism, so many signs for us. You know, I have a sister that's terminal, and she's been sick, I think 7 years now. And she is just like my mother. She keeps on going. She can hardly walk. You know, she drags her foot. You know, she can no longer use a cane. She uses a rollator. She stutters. And she's in constant pain. And she keeps dreaming. She keeps dreaming. I remember when she was going to turn 55. And she said, I just pray I don't die this year. I don't want to die when I'm 55. Because my mother was 55 when she died. Now my sister is getting weaker and in just a tremendous amount of pain. And this past January, she turned 59. And she said to me, wouldn't it be great if I lived long enough to see my 60th birthday? And I'm like, oh my God. You know, I mean, we were praying that she would get to the 55th birthday, and you know, now she's looking at her 60th birthday, and I have a feeling that it might not happen. She's now on palliative care, and she's needing more and more help. And she has more spells. And, you know, I called her the other day and I said, what are you doing? She says, I'm house sitting. I said, house sitting? I said, whose house are you at? And she told me, and I knew who the person was, and they have a dog. And so she has to make sure the dog goes out, you know. And I'm like, should you really be doing this? Oh, yes. All I have to do is open the door and the dog goes out and comes back. And, you know, I'm like, she just keeps on going. I usually go home every July for my father's birthday. And so I pick her up. I have for the last few years because she can no longer drive. And, you know, she said to me, now have you decided what day? I'm going, oh my, that's July. I haven't decided when I'm leaving. And, you know, so she wants to go back with me. And so my other sister calls me and says, what is she thinking? How can she make that trip? How is she going to be able to survive the summer? And, you know, and I'm like, Sarah, relax. I said, she's like mother. She has to have a dream. She has to have something to live for. And let her dream. And let us be a part of the dream as long as God wants us to be a part of it. She called me yesterday, crying. She had a dream. She was walking into church, our home parish. And she says, I was walking into church and I felt Mother's presence. I just felt her. I just knew her. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there. And she says, and then all of a sudden Aunt Sally appeared. Aunt Sally's my mother's oldest sister. And she was radiant, and she came up and she hugged me, and she told me she was so happy to see me. And she was so glad that I was there. And then Aunt Mary showed up, and that's my mother's other sister. And she says, but I could feel Aunt Tessie present, but I couldn't see her, just like I couldn't see Mother. And then we went for a ride, and we ended up at Aunt Margaret's. And I go, Aunt Margaret, oh my God, my Aunt Margaret's a great aunt, or whatever. And I'm like, what are you doing at her house? And she says, I couldn't get out of the car. And Bridget, that's our sister who has gone home to God. She has the same disease as Molly had. And she says she reached out and just pulled me out of the car and gave me a great big hug. And we went in the house, and it was just so wonderful, special meeting with them. They were all so happy to see me. And she's crying through the whole thing. And I'm like, oh my. And I believe in the communion of saints. And I know that as a priest, when somebody starts talking to the dead and seeing the dead, they're gathering. They're gathering just like we gather around them here on earth. And so, she says, I just wanted to share this with you, Timmy, and don't ever call me that. And, and I said, Molly, that's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And then she says, I gotta go now. She says, I just can't talk anymore. And I'm like, okay. I said, Molly? And she said, yeah. I says, don't plan on visiting them anytime soon. And she said to me, I'll do my best. And that gave me chills. Because 2 weeks before my mother died, we had a lot of legal issues when my mother died because my brother was killed a month before my mother died. And so there was no wills and all that stuff. And I had just come home from the lawyers with my father. And, we had no money. We still don't have any money. I mean, my father and mother never had a savings account. And it was just a lot of hassle for having nothing. And I looked at my mother when I walked into the house and I said, Mother, I says, because she asked me how things went, I says, all I got to say to you is you better plan on breathing for a while. And she looked at me and she said, I'll do my best. It just haunted me. We never know. We never know. But we got to make the best of what we have. This poor guy laid on a mat for 38 years. What's the problem? Why couldn't you try a little bit? Why couldn't you muster up a little energy? Why couldn't you psych yourself up? Yes, he's sick. But I know a lot of people that are really sick that have unbelievable strength. God is asking us to get up and jump into the pool. Be healed. Do something to let God work within you. Just don't sit there like a bump on a log. My grandfather used to tell me the story of his mother. Every time he talked about my great-grandmother, he just would light up when he talked about her. She was a great cook, she did this, she did that. She was like a saint. And then she went to the doctor one day, and he told her that she had a hole in her heart, and that she had to take it easy. Now, this is in the 40s, all right? So we didn't have all this modern medicine. And so my grandfather, these are his words. She went home and sat in a chair and did nothing till the day she died. She didn't even make an apple pie. You know, I'm like, okay, that shows your worth, whether you can make an apple pie or not. Well, my grandfather was getting old. He was maybe about 86 or so, still working. He still had his produce business. And we sold Christmas trees, and, you know, every year, 400 or 500 trees. And he wasn't feeling well. And so he was sitting in the house like this, in his favorite recliner. And he wasn't coming out and helping us or anything. So I went into the house and I sat down and I said to him, listen, I want to tell you a story. I said, there was this woman, I said, that went to the doctor one day, and I told the story right back to him. And I said, and I found out that she went home and she sat in a chair and did nothing. She didn't even make an apple pie. I said, and she sat there in that chair till the day she died. Now, are you going to be just like your mother? And he looked at me. I said, that's all I got to say. And I went back out and started working with the trees. About 20 minutes later, I looked outside, and there's my grandfather with a tree, cutting it and trimming it, getting it all ready, and he lived another 6 years. But you know, sometimes we feel sorry for ourselves. And sometimes, you know, we have to go to the Lord and say, help me. I put my life in your hands. And every time we do that, we're given hope. You know, I'm sure maybe some of you have signed DNRs. Have you? Anybody sign a DNR? You know, do not resuscitate. I have one. And I think I've had people call me as a priest saying, can I do this? Is this legal with the church? You know, blah, blah, blah. And my answer is, at some point in our life, we have to take our life out of man's hands and put our life back in God's hands and let God be God. And when we do that, we can jump in the pool because we know He's going to take care of us. We might not be healed physically, but we might be healed spiritually or emotionally, or maybe some relationships, you know, that have been strained might be healed. You know, I've seen it so many times when someone's dying, and the family's like, Father, why is my mother going through this? She was such a good woman. Why is she suffering so much? I don't know. I really don't know. But I do know that God is at work. That God is going to use this suffering for some greater good. And you know, so many times when that happens, I see the family come together. I see healing within the family that might not have taken place if it wasn't for that suffering. I I've shared this story before, so if you've heard it, just act like you've never heard it before. This lady used to go to church every Sunday, and she'd bring her grandchildren to Mass every Sunday because her daughter wouldn't go to church. But the grandmother made sure the kids went to church. And it broke her heart that her own daughter, who lived across the street from her, wouldn't go to church. She was just a grand lady. She thought she had a gallbladder issue. They brought her into the hospital. They went to do the surgery. They opened her up full of cancer. They closed her up, told her maybe 30 days. Everybody was devastated. Her 6 children all came home, and the Sunday before she died, I was celebrating Mass, and I looked up, and guess who was in church that Sunday? Her daughter, with her kids. And I was just so moved to see that. And I couldn't wait to finish that Mass and get my rear end up at that hospital to tell the mother what took place. And I got up there and, I always called her by her first and second name. And her name was, are we on live stream? Oh, I won't say her name. Anyway, I said, let's say Mary Margaret. I said, Mary Margaret, I said, you won't believe what happened this morning. And she looked at me and she said, I already know, Father. And I'm like, who's the big mouth that beat me here? This was supposed to be my news, And she took my hand and she said to me, Father, if I have to go through this so that my daughter comes back to church, it's worth every moment. And do you know, after she passed, her daughter was in church every Sunday. That's what I call redemptive suffering. Offering up for a greater good. So when we're hurting, whether it's the sniffles or something really serious, think of giving it back to the Lord and ask Him to work His wonders so that He can be glorified. This guy waited 38 years. I don't think He'll ever make us wait that long. But we just got to trust in Him. And that's our hope for today. God bless you.